Today, Monk, your Prairie Monk WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And it's Sunday, the 7th of February. It's cold out there. Make sure your water pipes are not going to freeze. And don't slip over on ice that has been slightly melted, so it's like a skating rink. I see people walking on it, and they're walking very carefully. And sometimes people who have been bicycling all their lives think that they can bicycle across this sort of stuff, and it doesn't work because the bicycle all of a sudden slips, and you end up with the titanium bones. So be careful out there. This is uh, risky time. Stay at home if you can, but don't forget to exercise. Uh, Today, I want to speak about meets and bounds. Uh, some time ago, we were made aware by the county, the DeWitt County, that we had adjacent to us a plot of land that hadn't been well defined or hadn't paid its taxes, and we were asked if we would like to buy it adjacent to our railroad bed. That inspires you to look at where this is. And meets and bounds were established when people were coming here to find property that they'd bought sight unseen in Europe, or they had made other arrangements. And the stone that was the boundary had been moved, the tree that had been blazed had died, and nobody knew where they were. So Jefferson put together a system of north, south, east, and west plats so that people could find out where they were. They were adapted some by major geographic situations like rivers, lakes, mountains, roads, railroad lines. The Jefferson Plat came in before there was a railroad line, but the railroad lines, to some extent, obeyed the Plat lines drawn up. Understanding these mechanisms is takes talent, and when we have to buy land for conservation or other purposes, we need to be able to define our land. If, for instance, you're wanting a tax exemption because you're preserving prairie, you need to know the limits. You need to know how to write those limits. And I'm probably not the best one to tell you, but I think we do enough with natural history that we need to alert you to what we can do and can understand, and how we can talk to people who do work with this sort of system. This is the sort of system that you get degrees in. They're usually applied degrees. For instance, the University of Illinois, which is more interested in fundamental research, would give this sort of task to Parkland College because it's somewhat applied. It's a little bit like the transfer of flight. Willard Airport has now gone into Parkland College. It's the applied side of science. Uh, so uh, people can be engineers, but then realize that they have to have this sort of knowledge also. So they will often get a second degree in uh, surveying. That means you have to know how to use a theodolite and uh, have assistance to hold uh, staff so that you can read the height. Uh, or so it's not easy stuff, but it's important. It meets and bounds, if you define it, is making sure that you have the bounds of your territory, and this is a legal term, and it's more than just your address. So if you live on Sunshine Boulevard and you're number 17, that you might be defining yourself in a way, but this is defining exactly how many feet of land you own and who are your neighbors. That's the bounds. The meets are more rough and tough. They're linearly established. Uh, so you have a surveyor with a theodolite, and it's a straight line to the next point. And uh, so the bounds can be a little more liberal in that there might be a fence or a tree or a rock or something that indicates your location. In the recent years, starting in the 20s with aerial photography, the sophistication of this sort of a discussion uh, got to be improved. So you had aerial photographs at a certain level above the landscape. So you might be 10,000 feet or you might be 30,000 feet. And that will give you a more general view or a specific view. Now we have satellite uh, uh, images, and those satellite images can be follow you around uh, your territory, and you can focus in. You can almost see the oil slick on a parking lot. So this is a great improvement, and you can also add photographs to your meets and bounds. So we have an older system which is still in vogue in a lot of places. Uh, and sometimes it has been surveyed by two or three or four different surveyors, and they all are slightly different. So it leads to legal questions as to who owns what. And it was roughly this person owns X number of acres. And you try to figure out what X number of acres is. Well, that system has improved considerably. Uh, Let me start off with a tax sale. Uh, we were asked to bid on 3 acres, which is at the junction of uh, Piatt County and DeWitt County. It is half a mile from a high school that is a combined high school where you used to have uh, a Piatt High School or a Weldon High School and a DeLand High School. They've been combined into a combined superintendent unit right on the junction of the two sections or the two counties. Uh, that particular high school does not have a lot of natural area around it, but just half a mile away is our railroad bed, which we have jealously preserved as conservation areas. since 1988. And farmers generally have been very respectful of what we're trying to do. It has its parallels in the Kickapoo Trail, which is 25 miles from Urbana to Danville. Uh, that trail was possible to get federal money for because in the 1880s, the federal government was getting worried that they were taking out too many railroads. The Steigers Act had allowed people to abandon short railroads that had problems of short sidings that only took a few cars and derailment possibilities because railroads, generally speaking, were not being maintained, not these little ones. The big railroads between Los Angeles and Chicago and New York and New Orleans and uh, other places, Georgia, for instance, uh, were still very active. Uh, and But the short lines were being replaced by road traffic that took grain to bigger elevators that were uh, super elevators. We have one in Champaign, down on the west side of Champaign, called variously Andersons or Cargills. It's maintained by a huge complex, and it has uh, three or four switches into so that you can store 100-car trains and load them respectfully and send them out. So these days we're looking at what do we own? Well, I think it would be helpful for me to act like a satellite feed. So I would, generally speaking, say that uh, when Illinois Central and Gulf closed out, uh, there was a triumvirate of railroads centered around White Heath. Uh, One spur went to Champaign, one spur went to Monticello, and one spur went to Clinton. The local train could uh, start out at Champaign, go to Monticello, go to Bement, go across to Decatur, then up to Clinton in a triangle, and then from Clinton it would be come back to Champaign via Lane, Weldon, Land, Lodge, Shady Rest, and White Heath. Uh, if I give you an aerial look at that, we have 7 miles in the middle, which was acquired by the Monticello Railroad Museum for their uh, rather popular uh, activities. Uh, they had acquired a parallel interurban. The interurban was a narrow gauge railroad that ran parallel to the main line. And I suspect that MRM, the Monticello Railroad Museum, didn't expect that the main line would close out, but it did. So uh, the Railroad Museum bought 7 miles of active line, and they operate on the main line now rather than on the interurban, although all their storage sheds are on the interurban. So they have to have switches that take the traveling public onto the main line for a 3 mile trip into Monticello, where there is a depot taken from another line and reestablished in downtown Monticello. That's a fun trip, especially for people who have never ridden on a train. Uh, but it uh, has to be protected. And that 7 miles, we have 4 miles in one end from Whiteheath to Champaign, uh, 6 miles from Monticello to Cisco across the Sangamon River, and 23 miles to Clinton. We own 27 trestles, which are hard to replace if they ever get burned. Uh, Usually wood. We don't have that sort of wood anymore to replace it. We have 3 truss bridges. And those bridges are revered by the people who are near them. And at Shady Rest, we have had a lot of support, mainly to preserve the Shady Rest Truss Bridge. So quickly, I'm going to give you an overall picture of those 3 lines that are on either end of the Railroad Museum. The Railroad Museum has at each end, it has acquired what we call Ys. These are where you can take that train and move it forward, then backward on the triangle, then forward, so that your engine again is on the front of the train. You can push railroad cars around, but it's not very approved of or not very practical, because sometimes you're dealing with older cars that don't exactly want to do what you want to do. So there is a Y at Whiteheath, and there is a Y at Monticello, and the Monticello Y allows you to go on to the Norfolk Southern Main Line, which is an active line that comes through Monticello. We're looking at Monticello broadly. Allerton Park is not too far away. Monticello itself is a historic town with its still its legal law court intact, and its streetscapes mainly intact. You have decent little parks that are wonderful. The Lodge Park is exceptional in spring, for instance, with understory herbs. People love to get married there or do meetings with families and whatnot. And then there's Shady Rest, and there are other parklets around that are important. There has been the possibility of damming the Sangamon River, that if you're in a flat country like we have, then that covers the landscape for miles and miles. And very helpful and knowledgeable people have done a lot to prevent that dam from being installed. There's always the possibility that might happen, but that's when you hope for people to rise up and say we want some of our natural area. In the whole process, we have lost most of our conservation prairie, our genetic gene pool, to farming or other uses. The state, according to Jack White, who's a respectable ecologist, less than 0.01% of the prairie landscape. Illinois was two-thirds prairie. Uh, Champaign County, for instance, was 94% prairie. So our ecosystem for us and the rest of the world is prairie. It's not the most aesthetic, it's so weedy. Some people love the 100 broadleaf species and half a dozen grasses, and for them it is interesting. For most farmers, it has been the weeds that they have had to get rid of. They had to drain the areas and get rid of the weeds before they could do agriculture. It's not the easiest to hug a prairie. You can hug a tree, you can sit under a tree for shade, uh, but if you sit in the prairie, you might just end up with chiggers and a few other creatures that live there. But the place is alive, and we don't deserve to lose this gene pool. In amongst those tiny insects that you can hardly see, or in the bacteria that are in the soil, there is genetic material, biochemicals that we may need in 500 years' time. That's if we're around that long, for a disease we don't know about now. So it's important to keep that gene pool. Okay, now I'm going to go to Cisco. I'm going to go. Cisco is between Monticello and Decatur. And then we hope in the long run that we're looking at a regional area that is Cisco, is Decatur to Danville with San Bernardino in the middle, Bloomington on the northwest, and uh, Arcola to the south. This is a region of the country which has very rich soils, and we've gained our wealth from this. The Kickapoo Trail is the first trail that we've been able to put in, because mostly the soil under the railroad line, under the ballast, is virgin glacial till. It was brought by glaciers, and when the world warmed up and the glaciers retreated, this glacial till became agricultural land. Some of it is in moraines where the glaciers used to melt and drop the load that they brought from the Laurentian Shield in Canada. So we have a little bit of landscaping, not a lot. But the micro habitats are interesting, and they preserve the dignity of the genetic material that we need for future generations. Okay, now I'm starting with a satellite feed at Cisco, which is 6 miles southwest of Monticello. And we're going to look in at three waterways that cross those 6 miles. They run towards Allerton Park. They run to the Sangamon. One is Willow Branch. Another is almost not named branch. And we're coming along to Armenia, which was where Sam Allerton put his invested in this. I would say several thousand acres of land after the Civil War, or near the Civil War, when he was supplying hogs and grain and food for the Union Army. The complex here was historic. It had an elevator, it had farm buildings, 2 houses that were traditional houses that you could buy out of Sears catalog. But somehow the Allerton Park was given to John Allerton, the son, and it's now been divided into the visitor part and the farm part, which is used to maintain the complex. Uh, so we have lost. The elevator got burned. There's two uh, concrete elevators that were more modern that remain. And so we're now moving along, and there's good prairie on either side of the railroad bed. It's uh, an endangered eastern Massasauga rattlesnake has been found there. One dead, but since uh, not too much information, although people have looked. Uh, in other parts of Allerton Park, the same rattlesnake is existing. So we know that the habitat is there. And Fran Hardy and others got together and convinced the university farms to put in 66 feet by a mile of uh, artificial prairie adjacent to the natural prairie on the railroad, with the aim of encouraging the rattlesnakes and other creatures. That was probably about 10, 12 years ago. And by now, the artificial prairie is looking like a regular prairie. But if you're looking from the satellite feed, you can see that uh, 1 mile has actually been extended. And uh, it comes to Wildcat Creek, which is a slightly larger drainage basin, and is supportive of quite an array of prairie plants. It's not the world's greatest uh, remnant prairie, but it's what we have. Everything else has been eaten up. And it goes along to uh, Applewood. It's a subdivision on the west side of the Sangamon River. It's the more modern part of Monticello. Our aim in buying this piece of land was to look at re-railing, perhaps top 5 grain at Cisco could take its grain around through Monticello and down to Bement, so that they would have a connection with a different railroad bed, the Wabash, and have 2 outlets, one to Decatur with a small grain line and one to Bement. We went through years of that sort of discussion, and the other alternative was to put in a trail, but we didn't want the trail to destroy the opportunity of business if necessary. So Monticello was willing, and the next 2 miles between Applewood, I think it is, it's where if you're looking in the satellite, you can see the library. It was for a moment Kirby Hospital. So there's another 2 miles there. The first 2 miles from Monticello coming west across the Sangamon and on a truss bridge was rather successful because it is safe, it was aesthetic, and it meant you didn't have to be on Bridge Road, which is the access to a parallel route 72. So if you waddle your satellite feed around a little bit, you'll see these features. And so from Applewood to County Farm Road has been extended. So if you're coming west towards Monticello, you encounter first the a 1 mile section that has just it's last summer been asphalted, and the original trail is concreted. Concrete is helpful if you're doing the trail yourselves, which Monticello did. If you have a tree that grows under a slab of concrete, you can repair it yourself. If the same thing happens with asphalt, you cannot repair it yourself. You have to have a contract with a asphalt company, then you have to have heated asphalt, and it's quite a detail. You can leave the surface unsurfaced, or surface it with chipped limestone, and that can be good, even in all weather situations. So that's what that extension has been for a while. So now we're coming through Monticello, and you have to know then your satellite feed will encounter 7 miles of Railroad Museum territory, and you will also encounter pieces of the old interurban that are owned by the city. Uh, the main line continues uh, northeast towards Cisco, to Whitey's. Uh, the interurban is, once you get across Camp Creek, which is a major drainage basin, uh, there's no interurban bridge there. It got to be decrepit and burned down on purpose. But the main line takes trains into the garage portion of the Railroad Museum, which is sort of on interurban ground nearby, appropriate switches. And that line continues, the main line continues up to Whiteheath. So does the interurban, and it is owned by the Railroad Museum also. Both lines have been partially used for demurrage. That means the parking of railroad cars from ADM and Decatur for storage during the off season, or during, and sometimes these cars are filled with products that are not being used. For instance, if you have a covirus and there's less transportation, you don't need as much uh, alcohol to substitute in gasoline. So you may have to store it for a while. So the Railroad Museum is using 3 miles, and the rest of 4 miles is often storage units. And people wonder why these trains are parked there, but they're parked there on purpose, and they provide some funding for the Railroad Museum. So we're traveling with our satellite feed, and you're in Whiteheath. You can notice that there is a Y, and the trains can go in several directions. The first one is that they can go to Champaign, and we're seriously hoping that we can get Monticello historic trains into Champaign. Not easy, not something that everyone agrees with, but it would allow an innovative interest and activate community affairs that we have adequate representation for at the national level. Very few of these sorts of lines have been re-railed, but some of the members of the Railroad Museum, not all, have established 5 years ago the Champaign, Havana, and Western Historic Railroad. And they have made an agreement with Heartland Pathways, which owns 4 miles from Whiteheath to Seymour, to re-rail that 4 miles to allow historic trains to come into Champaign. That's a dream. It's a costly dream. It's associated with with 7 miles of active line between Seymour, Bonneville, and Staley, which has uh, been abandoned. The trackage has not been lifted yet, and we're seriously hoping to get into Champaign on original rails without having to buy the land later and put down rails. So there's a negotiation there with the federal government, the Surface Transportation Board, to allow that to happen. And that means we also have to fundraise because some of the things that we did, excuse me, were done after we had purchased some of this land. It was innovative. The railroad people were watching and seeing that bicycle ways and hiking ways and natural history corridors were being bought by those people. So their suggestion was that they would like to use hikers, bikers, and natural history people to preserve those corridors for another use, public use, with the intent of preserving the corridor if the railroads needed to come back in. They're specifically interested in connections. So if you have Champaign, Staley, Bonneville, Seymour, Whiteheath, that's a connection to the Railroad Museum. And you go into Monticello and you can get on to Norfolk Southern. So you have a connecting. So the Rail Banking Act, which was passed in probably the 1880s, looked for that. Now, your satellite feed is in Champaign. We're looking for an old Big Four railroad depot that has some empty yards that could be an assembly for local events, and that would be a nice place to park a train. There's two lines there. One comes in from Bloomington, and if you take your satellite feed and run towards Farmer City and Bloomington, you'll know that there's an abandonment between Bloomington and Farmer City and Mansfield that is destined for a future trail. We don't have the piece from Mansfield into Champaign because it's an active line for taking grain out to a north-south Norfolk Southern line. So that remains active. So we can't come in on an empty railroad bed. That means we could, if necessary, take historic trains to Mahomet or to Urbana. Not easy because the administration of historic trains is very different from the administration of active trains. And if you're going to go over active lines, you're going to have to do that. So it's unlikely that we'll have the chance to take a historic train to some place like Mahomet because we'd have to pay for pilots and we'd have to totally reorganize the system to do that. So now take your satellite feed and run back to Whiteheath. From Whiteheath to Shady Rest, where there's another truss bridge, across Madden Creek, up to Lodge, to DeLand, Weldon, Lane, Weldon Springs, and Clinton. That's a wonderful 23 miles. And you can take your satellite feed and pull back so that you can see the entity of it. But then close up, Shady Rest is a rather wonderful uh, site. Was platted as a possible town that never happened. The Price uh, paint store people bought it and had it as a retreat. This was in the time of horses, and the retreat was on the banks of the Sangamon River, and so it has history, but it has natural history, and it is now in the purvey of the Piatt County Forest Preserve, and they have the tax base, the in perpetuity, to put in some trails and some parking place, and make it accessible to the public. Uh, so we're going across Madden Creek, another creek that comes into the Sangamon River there, up to Lodge. And we look at that from a regional planning point of view of taking historic trains down to Shady Rest, across the Shady Rest Truss Bridge. Perhaps we would stop for a novel experience with a recreated Chautauqua where people would come and meet. Then across Madden Creek up to Lodge, where there's a north-south line that is also used by the line that goes to Clinton at Mansfield. This, with a dream, you could take a Monticello Railroad Museum train, and if you had the money to put in the railroad line, that would take people down to Shady Rest, but also to extend them up to Lodge, so that you would have a 20-odd mile circuit for a train experience. Most of Champaign-Urbana's recreation is confined to the counties around, whether it's Vermilion County or Piatt County, Macon County, DeWitt County. DeWitt County has 2 lakes. It has Clinton Lake for power plant cooling, and Weldon Springs has a artesian lake that is. These 2 retreats are very well used state parks, and 5 miles of our railroad line joins these 2 parks. So now you are at the end of our satellite feed. I want to go back to the Piatt County, DeWitt County line. You'll find a high school and a grade school sitting on the county line, shared by both DeLand and Weldon. The road, Route 10, runs on either the section line or the half section line, and the railroad runs on the section line. So the railroad is just half a mile from the high school. We were given the opportunity to buy tax where taxes hadn't been paid. So we bid on that, and so yesterday I received a letter which recognized our bid. There were 3 bids, and we won. So the land is being subject to metes and bounds. That means somebody has had to go and survey it. And what I want to tell you about is how to define it. Unfortunately, the monuments that let surveyors find themselves used the railroads. So when the railroad abandonments took out the railroads, there was a huge battle to ensure that the railroad maintained the monuments for surveyors. Didn't eventuate. So these days, it is very expensive for a surveyor to go out and find a peg or to find a culvert where you could estimate the width of the railroad and the location of it and have some monumental base. Uh, so the document I have received uh, is the county providing a detailed description of the land. I've got a few minutes here. The land in Jeffersonian time was divided into principal uh, meridians. There are two or three or four in Indiana and Illinois. And so the first thing in this document, which looks like gobbledygook, but it's very intellectual. And so P is principal meridian, and then there are ranges uh, ranging from that. So if you go to a plat book, you'll go to range 19, and that means you're 19 units away from the principal meridian. Uh, so there are ranges and there are townships, and the townships are 6 square miles. And then there are sections which are a mile by a mile. So we're in uh, the Nixon Township, and we're in the section number 12. The 640 acres in the township, or in the the area between the principal meridians didn't have to be defined. So if you divide a section which is 640 acres, half of that section would be 80 acres. A quarter of it would be 40 acres. Many of the plots of land that you see from the era are 80-acre plots or multiples of that. And it's rectilinear and geometric and easy to estimate. Sometimes there's a creek or a river that makes for some differences. But basically, this is a rectilinear plot. Now, you go to that section, and if your plot is in the southeast corner, then you can divide that small plot up again into small units, the northwest, the northeast, and so forth. And as a surveyor, you have the opportunity to move through degrees. So if your post is 10 degrees, you can move your survey peg and know where you are. Then you can add items of interest that preferably would be permanent, like a fence or a road or a river or a lake or something that looked like it was going to be around for a while. That gives you your balance. So when we bid for this site, we had to go to the county and bid on the event and get it approved. And now we uh, received the okay that we own it, but then that plot has to be defined. Some of the surveys were loose, and there is often legality about where what is. Sometimes you would have three or four surveyors, and they would all differ as to where the points were. Uh, so it behooves us to have a good idea of what our land is like. And the city has done that, and it has sent me a letter to outline what our properties details are, what our meets and bounds are, and we have to pay a small fee for them doing that, and that goes into our files as property and deeds. Not easy stuff to do, but is important to do. Uh, in this case, there are also surveys of different details. If you have 80 acres next to somebody else's 80 acres, it's very easy to say, between this tree and this tree, we agree that's the edge of our property line. That's a very simple survey technique and not very costly. The next step is to have that area defined more specifically. The third element is to make sure that every detail is okay. So on 1/4 of a mile, which unfortunately has been dug up, we are likely to request the person who's dug it up to cease and desist because we own that land in warranty deeds. So that bring, brings us to a discussion of deeds. Warranty deeds mean you own it. The railroad came to you when it was coming through and bought the land outright. Then there are easements. Easements were where you promise to maintain the corridor while the railroad was using it, but then it would revert afterwards. And then there are adverse possessions where somebody didn't know who owned the land, and it was only 15 feet or something, and they went through anyway without any deeds. And then there are the railroad companies that know that they have a range of deeds, and some of them are revertible, and it's called a quit claim. So you get the title for the 33-mile railroad that we bought, but it includes the quit claim deed, and you have to have some reason for keeping it. Actually, conservation interests are a form of land use. So people can't say that we're next to an unused piece of land. It is very much used. And so we have the right to be there. And if we're there for 7 years, we have that sort of ownership. Basically, the farmers have been very respectful of our ownership. They didn't understand that some of their real interest was in the vacated area on either side of the right of way. So the ballast is in the middle. It's put in linearly, and the area, if it's 100 feet wide for an easement, then the area between the ballast and uh, the farmland where we need to find our genetic material. Sometimes that's been taken over, but the trail itself has been retained. And we hope that the example of the Kickapoo Trail and the Monticello Trail, both of which have been successful, not completed yet in the case of the Kickapoo Trail, and not extended yet by the Monticello Trail. But we are looking for you to understand the regional planning of this, how things come together, how we can talk to Bloomington, to Decatur, to Danville, to Champaign-Urbana. We have to get, if we have a rail with a trail, we have to come through by uh, Lincoln and University to very well-traveled areas. So we're suggesting a bridge across there that would allow connection to Kickapoo, to Champaign-Urbana, to eventually to uh, Monticello and Decatur, and perhaps connection to Mahomet and Farmer City and Bloomington. And so I want you to understand that. And I think we're we'll try and put this some visuals with this together uh, for Channel 6 and the YouTube. So I think we're coming to the end of time. Thanks very much for listening. It's not easy, uh, but we need you to know about it. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And with real thanks to WEFT and Urbana Public Television for helping us to do these sorts of programs.